Good afternoon. My name is Lucia Jacobs, and I'm a professor in the Department of Psychology and the current chair of the Department of Psychology's Lectureship Committee. This is the second year of a year-long series of faculty lectures to increase intellectual community and communication within the department. And today's lecture will be followed by two more faculty lectures, Professor Lance Kriegsfeld at the end of October and Professor Tanya Lombroso in early December. In addition, in 2 weeks, the department is hosting the Tryon Lecture, the Robert Tryon Lecture, which this year will be given by Kristen Hawkes in this room, Wednesday, October 15th, on the effect of the grandmother on human sociality and evolution. Finally, on November 10th, we've organized a day-long conference to honor the legacy of Edward Chase Tolman. The title of this conference is The Man and the Maze, and it's going to be in two parts. The first part, to honor his role as citizen. Tolman was the famous leader of the non-signers of the loyalty oath and paid many political penalties, including his job for that act. And the morning will celebrate that part of his history, and then the afternoon we'll switch to cognitive neuroscience, and we've got talks by David Foster and Edvard Moser coming in to celebrate the impact of Tolman's concept of the cognitive map 60 years later. Okay, so today, however, we're here to hear Christina Maslach. Each year, the committee chooses only one faculty member to give the annual Distinguished Faculty Lecture as a career retrospective. This year, that honor goes to Professor Maslach. Professor Maslach will be introduced by her longtime colleague, Professor Shelley Zedek. In addition to Shelley's long and distinguished career in organizational and industrial psychology, Shelley also served important roles as our chairman of psychology and also as vice provost for academic affairs and faculty welfare, having major impacts on the university. And speaking of another key role he played, of course, he starred in Frederick Weissman's brilliant documentary of Berkeley. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. The first thing I'd like to say is turn off cell phones, okay? Okay. Good afternoon. Today we're here to celebrate the academic and research career of our, you'll get that back. I touched on career of our distinguished colleague, Christina Maslach. We are celebrating her retirement from the university, though as most of you who are retired know, we emeriti do not go away, but continue to do everything we did as regular faculty, except we are off the state payroll. Okay? So I want to welcome all of you to this special occasion, and I want to at the outset acknowledge Chris's family, who are here today to join in the celebration. Phil Zimbardo, Tanya and Zara, and Patrick. Okay, okay. The Psychology Department's Distinguished Speaker Lecture is presented by someone who's contributed to the field, the department, and university in more ways than time allows me to speak. Chris Maslach is a perfect example of someone who has made remarkable contributions to research, teaching, service within the department, the university, the profession, and to public policy. She is the model for all academic careers. I will shortly briefly acknowledge the many contributions made by Chris, but before I do, I would like to present some history regarding her career at Berkeley. This is mainly for the younger people, the graduate students, and our younger faculty. I don't think you know enough about our heritage, and I've said this to Rich Ivory on a number of occasions. We need a history course, so you should understand the heritage of this department. Chris Maslach joined the department in 1971 after graduating from Stanford University. In 1971, the department was structurally organized into 3 groups. You ready? 1, 2, and 3, okay? There was no real intellectual substance to the formation of the 3 groups, but rather a sociometric amalgamation of who got along with whom. When Chris joined the department, she joined Group 1, which at that time had one other social psychologist, and some of you remember Tom Crawford. I, who had joined the department in 1969, was in group 3, the group that got along with everybody. Okay. At the time, there were 3 other industrial organizational psychologists. So Chris was one person with another social psychologist, and I had 3 colleagues. By around 1974 or so, 2 important events or situations had occurred. One, the department had reorganized into 7 substantive areas, one of which was social psychology. At that time, it was not linked to personality psychology. And the second important event was the fact that Chris then was the only social psychologist, and I was the only industrial organizational psychologist, thus resulting in 2 non-tenured faculty forming the social group, social psychology group and social group. Okay. I point this out because today we have a very vibrant social personality group that is thriving due to Chris's efforts, which began in the early 1970s, not only in developing the program, but heavily invested in recruitment efforts, curriculum development, and for those of you who may be surprised, when Chris joined the department, there was no social psychology laboratory. It was through her efforts that a lab was developed, I believe, on the 5th floor of Tolman, which provided opportunities for research for faculty and students for many, many years. So for you younger social psychologists, social personality now, you have Chris to thank for the laboratory that was established then. The other historical fact that I want to mention is that Christina Maslach was the first female psychologist offered a tenure-track position in the department after a period of 42 years. Between 1929 until 1971, a period of 42 years, she was the first one to be offered a tenure-track position. As an historical fact, and I think, Sue, you may have been involved in this one, a university report noted that this department, psychology, had the largest gap across years in female hiring on the campus. Not something we are proud of, okay? Though the trend was thought to hold across the campus. So she was not only a pioneer in developing social psychology within the department, but she also set the stage for female faculty in our department. I also should point out, I don't think Eleanor's here, but as an aside, when Chris was hired in 1971, Eleanor Roche was also hired in 1971. Famous cognitive psychologist. But for those of you, unless my memory is totally out of date or messed up, Eleanor was hired to fill a social psychology slot in the department, right?
That's true.
So we would have had then 3 of us. Okay. So enough history of the department. Let me provide some background on Chris as a researcher, teacher, and model department university citizen. And this is a very condensed version. From the perspective of research, Chris is the major pioneering figure in the study of burnout, a topic she began studying in the 70s and in which she is still active. Her instrument, the Maslach Burnout Inventory, is the most widely used research measure in the burnout field. But her talk is going to tell you all about burnout, so I'm going to leave the content of that topic and what it's all about to her. But I want to acknowledge how her research has been recognized by others. In 2009, she received 2 awards from the Journal of Organizational Behavior for co-authoring 2 of the 8 most influential articles in its 30-year history, both of which dealt with burnout. In 2012, she and colleague Michael Leiter were honored as authors of one of the 50 most outstanding articles published by the top 300 management journals in the world for their longitudinal research on early burnout predictors. In further recognition of her research, she became a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science that cited her for groundbreaking work on the applications of social psychology to contemporary problems. In 2013, she received a Lifetime Career Achievement Award from the 10th International Conference on Work, Stress, and Health. Though she received this Lifetime Award, it doesn't mean that her research career is over. Some might say it is just beginning. In 2014, this year, she and Michael Leiter launched an e-journal called Burnout Research. So the obvious point from this background is Chris has not burned out. Okay? Now let me comment on her teaching accomplishments. Her course evaluations were excellent, and she mentored numerous graduate students who went on to have illustrious careers in teaching and research. Her passion for teaching and the impact it has had on students is recognized by Chris's receipt of the campus's Distinguished Teaching Award in 1987. the Distinguished Teaching Award from the Western Psychological Association in 2008, and the National Award as Professor of the Year from the Council for the Advancement and Support of Education and the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching in 1997. Now, I want to note that several of these awards are based on course evaluations and comments from former students who described her approach to teaching and her impact on their careers. But Chris also was engaged in activities that had broader impact for many who are not her students. One prime example is Chris's role in establishing the department's Teaching Resource Center in the 1980s and 90s, which included compiling demonstration projects that GSIs could use in any psychology class. This was of great benefit to many GSIs who were teaching for the first time. This concern for assistance and for the teaching development of others marks Chris's career and was recognized by her being awarded the campus's Faculty Award for Outstanding Mentorship of GSIs in 2001. Now for service, she served on numerous professionally, she served on numerous editorial boards, was scientific advisor for the Center for AIDS Prevention Studies, and president of the Western Psychological Association. Within the department, she had served on many roles, a lot of search committees during the 1970s when we kept on searching for social psychologists. Within the department, she served as vice chair of the department from 93 to 98. On the campus level, she was faculty assistant on the status of women. And from 94 to 97, she was chair of the Academic Senate in 2000 and again in 2012 and 13. And consistent with her interest in teaching, she was vice provost for undergraduate education and instructional technology from 2001 to 2008. For all of this service, Chris received the Berkeley Faculty Service Award in 2010. To end, let me just mention one more award, the Berkeley Citation, which Chris received in 2009. This award is presented to those who have rendered distinguished or extraordinary service to the university. It is awarded to those whose attainments significantly exceed the standards of excellence in their fields and whose contributions to UC Berkeley are manifestly above and beyond the call of duty. As the record shows, Chris was a no-brainer for this award. So now, with further ado, let me invite our very, very distinguished, newly retired faculty member, Chris Maslach, to present a lecture on a significant difference, reflections on a psychology career. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming and sharing this time with me. It's those of you, some of you know, but others may not, that I started my career here at Berkeley in '71 as a brand new PhD, and I've been here ever since. Somehow I never thought about my career would be a single job. I don't think anybody plans what their career is going to really look like. You don't know. But I've been here for more than 40 years and sort of figured, okay, this is time to kind of move on to some other things and not have to commute every day from San Francisco, but still be involved in some way. So officially retiring, and it's great to have the opportunity to sort of think back on that long career at Berkeley. And what is it that I'd like to share with you today as sort of reflect on all of this. Okay, so what I decided to do was figure out some themes about significant difference. Most of you in the room, I'm sure, think of significant difference, know that this is this mantra we were taught from the very beginning in graduate school about statistics and analysis and research and all of these things, and a significant difference were the kind of things that we had to be able to figure out how could we strive to achieve in some way. And so one of those is, in fact, I want to talk about that. Sort of in my career is what I consider a significant difference in the kind of scientific research that I've been doing. But there's two others that I'd like to also allude to. One is in actually studying differentness. This is where, oddly enough, where I started. And so this is something I'd like to share with you. And then finally, a third theme of a significant difference in working on a social problem. So let me begin with a a few other things that I want to include, which are periodically do some reflections within those three themes. And one of them is what I'm going to call gender moments. And I'm doing that because it turns out that the period of time from the early 70s to now has really been an extraordinary period in terms of women's liberation, certainly women as professors in academia. And so there's things about my career and what I did that are really shaped in some ways by that period of time of the late 20th century. So I want to bring a few of those, not all of them, to bear as we go through. And periodically there are some career issues, both in academia in general and psychology that I want to talk about, and I'll reflect on those. And then finally, I'm going to share a number of thoughts from Ralph Waldo Emerson. Now, why, you should say, should I do that? Well, I went to Emerson Elementary School here in Berkeley when I was growing up. My dad was an engineering professor here, so this was my hometown. Another thing I never thought I'd do is come back to my hometown and be a professor, but it's the way it works. And one day someone said, "Do you know who Emerson is?" And I said, "No." You know, who's, you know, he said, "Well, somebody who wrote some very interesting things and you should find out." So over the years, I have gone back to Ralph Waldo Emerson and have found that he had a lot of very interesting things to say about the kind of psychology research that I was doing. So I'll share a few of those. I might say that Emerson is also known and is quoted as saying, "I hate quotations." And you might say, so why am I going to quote him? But he actually meant by that, that's taken out of context, "I hate quotations, tell me what you know." He really disliked people avoiding saying something and just sort of give a quotation instead and not really get into the idea. So hopefully I'll come up with some better ones. So first thing I wanted to share with you is, why did I decide to go into research? I mean, there could have been all kinds of other things that any of us do. So what was the thing that got me excited, interested, saying, you know, I'm going to do it? Well, as it turns out in many things in life, serendipity played a big role. If this hadn't happened, who knows what I would be doing now. But at any rate, I was an undergraduate student at Harvard, actually Radcliffe. We're not quite officially Harvard yet, so we were Cliffies. And I was working for a professor in what was known as the Social Relations Department, kind of a social science department of psych, sociology, anthropology. And I was earning money. I hadn't really done any research or something. And all of a sudden he comes by and he's grabbing all of us from our different, rooms or cubicles saying, "There's a photographer here from Time Magazine. They want to take pictures of college students on campus. We need to get a group of you looking like you're having an intelligent conversation. Come into this room." So we all go into the room and, sit around. And the photographer there is taking pictures. And professor turns to one of the students, who was my classmate, Phoebe Ellsworth, who's done a lot of work in emotion. And she had already graduated, and she was now working as a research assistant. And he said, "Phoebe, why don't you tell everybody about the study you're working on how people respond to help when they get someone else comes to their aid?" So she gave a little presentation, talked about what she was doing. And then they started asking people, "So, what do you think about it? Or do you have a different idea about this research?" They said, "So, Christina, what do you think?" I'm going, because I had not ever done research. I hadn't been, doing something like this. So thinking fast, I went to another course that I was taking at that time. I like to take art history courses as sort of my minor. And I was in the process of taking a course on Japanese art. And I, as part of that, was learning the art, but also reading about history and culture of Japan. And so she had said that one of the factors they were going to look at was the circumstance of the gift, the favor that was helping somebody out. So for some of the people, they would get help, and the person would say, and it's a help was a gift of money. "Don't worry, you don't have to pay me back. I don't need that." Okay, so no obligation or low obligation. Then there was another condition for people who said, "Here's a gift, pay me back when you can." So it's a reciprocal. And then the third condition was high obligation. pay me back when you can. And by the way, maybe you could do another little favor for me later on. Okay? So as I heard her say that, I immediately started thinking about Japan and the art and the work and everything that I was talking about and said, I think it would be different in Japan. It would not be this linear effect that was predicted, that the less obligation you would like the person the most obligation you'd like them least. So, the more strings attached to the gift, attraction, liking, wanting to work with this person would change. And I said, from what I've been reading, it's not just obligation, it's status. This is what this all means. And these are peers, these are students working with each other. And in the equal obligation or the equal status condition, they'll be okay with that, but I don't think they'd like the person who charges extra, but I also don't think they're gonna like the person who gives you a freebie. Because basically that person is saying, I'm better than you, I'm giving you money, and I'm not letting you pay me back and reestablish equality. So that was my hypothesis. First time I ever had a hypothesis. And people sort of started, oh yeah, kind of interesting. And I'm going, I got something out. And then, lo and behold, within a couple of weeks, professor came and said, how about you go to Japan and do that study? You could get there. I'm going to call someone. I'm having somebody over in East Asian Studies. They're going to do the translation. We have money from a grant for airline ticket. I'll contact somebody in one of the universities. Mind you, I had never done research. A. B. I had never been to Japan. I did not speak Japanese. It was kind of like, So here was this idea that I had just sort of, put out there. And in a couple of weeks, I was in Japan and met the professor there who said, here's some room where you could do the research, and here's a graduate student, Chieko Tashiro, and she will work with you on this. I'm leaving tomorrow for the summer, so I won't be here. And by the way, did you know that the students who take courses in the summer here in Japan are all foreigners? They're not Japanese students. And I'm thinking, gaijin, like me, foreigners, and I'm thinking, I came across the world to get research on Japanese college students, Japanese male college students, to replicate what was being done with American college male students, and I'm going to get American college students here. This was like, this is going to be disaster. Serendipity again. God smiled because there's an all-male university in Tokyo, Keio University. They had gone on strike in the spring, and they were now making up their classes for one more month in July. So I had a subject pool of men, college men, who I could have in my study if I could get them involved and they'd agree to go and whatever. So it was a bit of a trial by fire for your first experiment. What this is going to be like was really, really kind of challenging, but it was so exciting. And getting this data and then working through the translations of what people did and all of this kind of stuff, the thing that was so exciting about it, for me, you can see that, the power and excitement of evidence. This was like, it's not just you have an idea or somebody else has an idea and you think it's cool. This is about a process and methods and ways of gathering evidence and having ways of evaluating all this to see if there's any merit to the idea about human behavior. And I was thinking, this is so cool. And it was kind of like, I want to do this. So went back, wrote this up for my honors thesis, and applied for graduate school because I said, I want to be doing more research. So this is the thing that got me started. I had not a clue beforehand that I would have felt this way. And this is just to share with you the Japanese effect, which the hypothesis was borne out big time, very significant difference. I'm even cheating a little bit on the USA data. It was not quite that good. But the Japanese data were fabulous. And so it was, not only to do the research and get excited about it, but then just to see how the data emerged from all of this. Okay, a few reflections here. Let me tell you about Emerson. It is not the office of a man to receive gifts. How dare you give them? We wish to be self-sustained. We do not quite forgive a giver. We can receive anything from love, but not from anyone who assumes to bestow. It is a good man who can receive a gift well. And what's kind of interesting, I don't know about you, but I actually hear a male voice there. I'm not sure I would hear a woman saying that in quite the same way. Fortunately, I was doing a study with all men, okay? And this is another little sort of important gender thing. At that time, this is now in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s it went on, the emphasis was on getting homogeneous research samples. As much as possible, they are all the same group so that all you have is the variables that you're putting in there. And the homogeneous samples in a lot of experiments tended to be male, all male. And I once raised this question with some professors, sort of, well, you could have all female, or you couldn't have both, and sort of, And I would get answers like, men give you better data. They are consistent, they know what they're doing. Women kind of have all this other stuff going on, variance, noise, whatever. Men will give it, that's how you're going to find out about things. That's why we're doing it. So I just wanted to sort of mention that at that time. Another little gender theme, not gender theme, but a career theme actually, and this was, okay, exciting data, cross-cultural, trouble getting it published. And this is something that has gone on throughout my career. In this case, it was from the senior professor and the PI and the guy who had the money for the grant. Phoebe and I were now at Stanford at graduate school getting our PhDs, and we were all excited about the results that we had gotten in both the United States and Japan. And so we were writing saying, so could we submit this for publication? Imagine we would get a publication by the time we were, out on the job market, which was unusual at that time. People didn't publish stuff before they got a job. But we thought, wow, And we offered to help and do more analyses. We could do some writing, We wrote, and we got back this answer, girls, what is all this professional stuff coming out of your mouths, kind of thing. It was like, I will take care of it when the time is right. You just do your thing. So we had to wait for a long time, and it finally did get published in JPSP, Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. For those of you who don't know, that is the leading journal for my field, so that was good. But in '75, we did this research 10 years before. It took a while, and it took a while because the person in charge, didn't really take us very seriously. Okay, so another thing about doing research, that was my very first, but this was, got started in graduate school at Stanford. And this is really about not just doing research, but knowing how to do it better, how to improve it, how to get to a better place with it. And this was an important part of our graduate school training, which was that we would have to critique major experiments in social psychology. And everybody can do that after a while. Graduate students were notorious for critique, this problem, that problem, that. The hard part was part 2. You had to design a better study of that hypothesis, okay? And you had to come up with, well, okay, maybe you wouldn't do it this way. How would you do it better? Soon the idea has some merit. How would you do it? So one of my fellow students, Gary Marshall, and I took the Schachter and Singer hypothesis about emotion. And this was, at the time, controversial because it was coming up with a new idea about what emotion is. The research design was controversial, and other people said, it's controversial, it has nothing to do with emotion. It was also controversial because the results were much weaker than the idea, okay? But if you go back to textbooks at that time, it was being published everywhere in great detail. And this was part of, the emotion literature. So there was a lot to critique. And Gary and I wrote up our critiques, and we wrote up proposals for doing it better. And instead of just getting our grade on our paper and whatever, we decided to actually do the research. So in Schachter and Singer, they're basically proposing that emotion is made up of 2 parts, an arousal, which is neutral, and social cues in the environment, which will either lead you to say, oh, that arousal is happiness. I'm feeling happy because that person's happy and I'm feeling around. Or same neutral could be experienced as anger if you had cues in the environment that said people are angry, there's bad things going on. In our research, we essentially did a couple of things. We did an exact replication of Schachter and Singer and got the same lack of results that he had, kind of a nice replication in a way. We then did an improved replication of Schachter and Singer, adjusted the arousal state, which was being given by an epinephrine injection, and we discovered that he really wasn't giving them very much epinephrine, so nobody was feeling arousal. But if you adjusted it, and we had physiological measures, and got people feeling aroused and not thinking it was the injection, we got a different result. And then the new methodology, which I had, was using a hypnotic suggestion with trained hypnosis subjects to begin to experience arousal when they saw a word on something they were reading. And both of our improved things found that actually the arousal, if people are feeling something and it's unexplained, they don't know why, it is never viewed as positive. It's always viewed as negative. And there is a negative bias towards looking for what could be the cause of this bad thing I'm feeling. Even if people were in a situation where they were feeling arousal and somebody was being happy and laughing and joking, and they would smile and whatever, and then they'd say, oh God, she was such a chatty Cathy, but I'm just feeling lousy. I know I have to talk to my mom tonight, and I'm worried about it. I'm just feeling bad, kind of thing. So this research took a lot of work, but it came out of essentially the training about research as to how to do it well, how to make sure that you're getting rid of different problems, how do you do the comparisons, all of this kind of thing. What does Emerson have to say about this? I love this quote. The sun shines and warms and lights us, and we have no curiosity to know why this is so. But we ask the reason of all evil, of pain and hunger and mosquitoes and silly people. So what we were finding was that there is this negative bias. If something is going on that is leading us to feel uncomfortable or anxious or upset, we want to know why, and we're looking for it. We may not find the right answer, but we look for that. Whereas if people were, happiness, no. Okay, trouble getting published. Now this was a very different situation because when I wrote up the article and sent it out for review, who is going to be asked by the editors to review this? Schachter himself. And those of you who, were active in those days know that this was a very famous, powerful, influential person. And so I was not getting anywhere with this research. And then what happened was that I then got told by someone in the department that Schachter was going to come visit Berkeley. I said, oh, really? And visit Berkeley. And by the way, he said while he was there, maybe he could have a chance to chat with you. And I thought, okay. And then I started getting, Jack Block came over and said, do you mind if I sit in on that conversation that you're going to have with Schachter? And Richard Lazarus came over and said, can I sit in on your conversation? And after a while, it was becoming a departmental event. It was like, fight, kind of, and everybody's going to come in, and we're going to see what's going on. And I wasn't getting tons of support on it. People just wanted to see what I was going to do, and what I was going to say. And I wasn't hearing people saying, I think this is maybe interesting data, or here's how you might talk about it with him, or whatever. So what I did do is I called my mentor at Stanford, Al Hastor. He was an incredible person who I always could go to and ask for advice and whatever. And so he had some ideas of, how you might do this. But the important thing that he said to me, because I was feeling all alone, and he said, you must have something significant to say, because nobody would be paying attention to you if you didn't. So the fact that they're all coming and Schachter is coming and everybody's coming to hear what you have to say, take it as a good thing, So went in, had interesting public debate with Schachter about all of this stuff. And I think that actually helped the new editor for JPSP to accept the article with each of us writing articles that commented on each other afterwards. And so it finally did get published 10 years later in 1979 in JPSP. Interesting moment there. Okay, so let me turn to the second theme of significant difference. This is about studying differentness. When I was a new graduate student at Stanford, came in first day of classes and everything, and I had to meet with one of the professors that I was assigned to work on with, in the first year. And I'm not sure kind of where I got to this, but there was a lot of stuff on conformity and social norms and whatever, and I kind of was interested in people wanting to do something different, to go in a different direction or stand out from the crowd. And so I went into his office and I said, here's what I'm interested in, and maybe we could do some research with you and whatever. And he listened to me for a while, and then he said, we've already done a lot of research on deviance, which is what differentness was known as at that time, deviance from the norm. Deviance. And in fact, I have just written the book, Psychology of Deviance. There is nothing more to be done because it's all done and here in this book. So go find something else. So it's like, not an auspicious first day. I kept thinking, Japan, data, this is good, kind of thing. I can do it somewhere else. A few years later, for my dissertation, I was still gnawing on that problem. And now I had come across a construct Bob Ziller had developed called individuation. And it was really interesting because it wasn't sort of negatively biased like deviance is. You don't think of being positively deviant, that's a negative thing. But this was about how differentiated you are physically, socially, in different ways from other people. It could have positive and negative aspects to it. And so my dissertation research was setting up interactions between students in the lab where they could choose how they wanted to present themselves, how unique and interesting their answers were on questions, all kinds of things. We individuated some of them, we de-individuated others, and we varied whether there were positive social consequences. They could win some prizes, they could do some good things, or whether there was a risk of negative consequences if they stood out. And basically found, this was all kinds of behavioral data, 75 measures of, because we had observers and coding and all sorts of things, but basically showed that when people think there is something positive out there, and it could be a reward, it might be people are going to like you or something like that, you do things and you behave differently to kind of call attention to yourself. Look at me, Whereas when you're in a situation where the consequences might be negative, it's like somebody who doesn't want the teacher to notice because they don't have the answer to the question and you're just trying to kind of be down and whatever. And we could see how behaviorally, I've always been interested in watching and observing and collecting data on actual behavior of people in social situations. So that was my dissertation. So I finally got individuation instead of deviance. And at Berkeley, when I got here, I did a number of things on individuation. We looked at all different kinds of social behaviors, dissent, personal self-disclosure, eye contact, expressive gestures, did some other research using archival data where we were pulling out greater leadership behavior, greater participation in all kinds of groups, like playing charades and doing other things like that. Second thing I did was develop an individual difference measure, individuation scale, and how willing are they to do things that might make them stand out from everybody else? Are they comfortable with that or like, oh, never? And I just have to sort of make a little comment here that I came from Stanford in terms of my PhD training. What was personality at Stanford? Al Bandura and Walter Mischel. Not an individual difference between them, They did not believe in it, they didn't talk about it, they didn't do personality assessments at all. okay? Come to Berkeley, very different. This is personality assessment central. So one of the things was that some people started teaching me how to do assessment of individual differences. And this was one of them. So I used that in research, and then with my graduate students, we were really interested in using the archival data at what was then IPSR, and the MBA students. And they would be studied over a course of 2-3 days, I think it was, and they did all kinds of exercises and all kinds of behaviors, and they went to lunch, they got interviewed, they filled out measures. We thought, great, we had great tests of hypotheses for that, but how do we get into that archival data? Because the personality measure was the Q sort. Well, Jack Block helped me figure out how to translate essentially the individuation scale into a Q sort prototype, into Q sort language, so we could then go and look at all the archival data and look at the behavioral tests of hypotheses that we were interested in. And one of the things I wanted to say is that the work I was doing on individuation really anticipated a lot of other things that got published in the 70s and 80s. And I'm saying this not because it was because of individuation, no, but there was a zeitgeist, if you will, at that time where a lot of people were thinking about people stepping out, being different, taking the lead, risking, social negative consequence. So these are just some of the things at that time: independence, salience, distinctiveness, uniqueness, minority influence. Arlen here is one of the people there on that. So this was all kind of going on at around the same time. And, whereas before it was all more of the focus on conformity, we were seeing really a change in that. Some reflections. Emerson: to be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment. Now, had I had a normal career path, I have my dissertation, I go to a new place, I do study after study after study on my dissertation, and I probably would have gone on and had a lot more on differentness to tell you about. That's not what would happen. If you look at the publications that I did on individuation, there is a huge gap between my dissertation in '74 and then all the other JPSP articles starting in the 80s and 90s. What happened? Well, basically, there were two things, and this is when I was an assistant professor, as Shelley mentioned, the only social psychologist in the department, and I didn't have a lab. I had been promised one, but I didn't get it. In fact, it finally got built on the 5th floor. We finally got, thanks to Jeff Keppel, we got some space. I got money from the state for rehabbing it when I went up for tenure. So getting your lab just at that point was kind of an interesting, thing. So I didn't have the lab that I should have had because I was trained as an experimental social psychologist. The second issue was what I would call the lurking spouse. After I started at Berkeley, I got married. And I got married to Phil Zimbardo, who was a professor at Stanford, where I had just gotten my degree. And so I was told, after a couple years, when you have your mid-career review, very ominous sounding, mid-career, 2 years, but what they said was, we noticed that you've started publishing some things with your husband. We had gotten interested in a whole new topic on time, psychology of time perspective. If you're in the moment, if you're future-oriented, all this kind of stuff. And we had started to publish. We had one in science. We had one in psychophysiology. Very exciting. They said, this will not count for you. It'll be assumed it's his work, not yours. So even though those are publications that are coming out, they aren't really going to help. Furthermore, I said, well, okay, but I'm starting work on my dissertation research and, doing other things. They said, well, about that dissertation, we don't know to what extent that's Stanford stuff and what role he might have played and will continue to play, so that doing any research on individuation on your dissertation will count negatively, even if he's not a co-author. So the sense of lurking, he might really be, doing things here, pulling the strings, all his work, I know, yeah, meant that I had to stop that research as well. So I've got a few more years to go, and they said, find something new to do, okay? So, my career took a different little path at that point than I had intended. The other thing I really want to talk about is what it was like as a brand new PhD assistant professor at Berkeley in the early 70s. Shelley mentioned the thing about the Blue Book. And this was this report that Sue, Irvin Tripp, and some others had done, looking at, so what is the status of women on the campus? This was, Women's Lib was happening in the 60s and all this kind of thing. At the time that Eleanor and I started in 71, it was between 3 and 4% of the faculty were women, okay? The faculty club was the men's faculty club, and only men could go in there until Sue went through a window to get into a meeting because she couldn't go in the front door. So, yay, Sue. As Shelley mentioned, the report it listed all the departments that were zero, members of the Zero Club, I think, or the Zero departments. They had never, ever hired a woman as a professor, tenure track professor, in the whole history of Berkeley. That's one group. Then there was everybody else, all the other departments who had hired at least one or more women as tenure track professors, and those were ordered, as Shelley said, in how long it had been since they had done their last hire. And there, psychology was at the top of the list, number one. They had gone the longest on that. And when I heard about this was the year before, this is like I'm getting ready to go out on the job market. And I was shocked because when I thought of Berkeley, I thought of all kinds of women whose publications I would read. I mean, there was Nancy Bailey, there was Mary Coverd Jones, there was Jean Block, there was Marjorie Hanzik, there was Dorothy Eicher. I mean, there was a lot of women publishing, mostly developmental, which I had been told, I had been dissuaded to apply to social in graduate school because developmental was the woman's field. But at any rate, so there they were, and how could Berkeley not have women? They're all there. I discovered later that they were not ever given tenure track positions. They were given researcher positions, usually in IHD, Institute of Human Development, and they published and did work, but because they were not professors, at that time they could not be PIs. And it took many, many, many years before that rule changed. So, when you think about it back then, that was not a good state for Berkeley in psychology, to be. Oh, I might, so Eleanor Roche, as Shelley mentioned, we were the first tenure track to be hired almost 50 years. My count was, when they published the report, it was like 47. Sociology was 46 years. I mean, it was, way up there. And one of the things I just wanted to share with you again about that time is that there was a letter that came out from the chair. In those days, we didn't have a whole search process. It would be the chair would send a letter to other departments saying, we've got a job in social, you guys got anybody? And then there would be a little matchmaking going on. So this was a letter that came out trying to acknowledge all the brouhaha about the Blue Book report, but not quite wanting to acknowledge it. So it was an interesting letter which said, we have a position in social psychology, and of course ears pick up, yeah, and that the department is going to be flexible with regard to sex. And it's kind of meaning you want to hire some women is maybe what that means or something like that. So I applied to the job, and I'm going to just share with you a little anecdote about it, just to say this was the kind of time it was, that you knew going in as a woman it was going to be hard. You were not going to be taken as seriously. And so it was like, how do you get past that? You know that that's happening. Here's this department really trying to turn around and finally hire a woman. One of the people who wrote a letter for me decided to, thinking primacy effect here, wrote the letter in a way not to signal that I was a woman. So how do you do that? Well, instead of saying, Christina, has shown that she can do excellent teaching, it said, Chris. Male, female? Okay, Chris, and no pronouns. Chris does an excellent job of teaching. The whole letter was about Chris. No pronouns, no he, she, his, her, until maybe at the final end or something like that. And that was one of the letters. Now, my students always, did it work? I mean, it really worked. I said, I had no clue. What's important is to say that was our mindset, that we had to do something like that in order to get maybe a little edge up and be considered, for the job. So we've come a long way. Response to these new women, I mean, it was funny at first. Eleanor and I were both there. Daily Cal came by. What does it feel like to be a woman at Berkeley? And, just all sorts of stuff. People would come by. I had people coming by, see me in my office, annoyed that Professor Maslach was not there for office hours and left a note for the secretary to tell him that, he had shown up and why. I had female students come in, just race in, shake my hand, say, I don't want to ask a question, just want to say I'm glad you're here, run out again. Had male students who were very uncomfortable having a woman as their professor, teaching a class, and when I was asking why, it was clearly I'm calling the shots, I'm giving you a grade. Well, I could be taking you out on a date, kind of thing. We're getting into that sort of issue. So it was an interesting first beginning at Berkeley. So what about Emerson? I have thought a sufficient measure of civilization is the influence of good women. Okay, now moving on to a third theme of significant difference is working on a social problem. So here I am. A couple years, I have to start a new line of research. I can't do my dissertation research. I can't do the time research. I don't have a lab. What am I going to do? So I go back to my emotions study that I was still trying to get published at that time, still talking with Schachter and whatever, and thought I could take something from that. I could develop some hypotheses, and then maybe the lab will come and I can begin to go do that research. And I was interested in the process that we're sort of getting at of attribution. How do people understand what it is they're experiencing? What do they look to as cues to why this is happening or how it could change? And I got interested also in how people cope with really strong emotional feelings. And is there something about a reattribution or a misattribution? Could you use that kind of processes to cope with really difficult emotions at a time when you needed to be very calm and rational and handle things well? So I got interested in that out of that other research, and I thought, okay, what I will do is I will go out and talk to people who are in jobs that I think might deal with this kind of thing. So I started talking to people in hospitals. I'd talk to people in ER, in pediatric oncology, where kids were dying of leukemia. I was talking to police officers. I was talking to a number of people, because I thought I couldn't find much in the literature that was relevant, and I thought maybe let me just test it out and see if people say, yeah, that makes sense, I could understand that. Serendipity strikes again. I was doing something very different than I was trained to do. I was doing interviews. They were qualitative. They were field-based. There was no lab. And it's obviously on a very applied issue, social problem. How do you cope with this on the job? And what I was finding is people would talk to me and answer questions and say, but I really want to tell you about, and then they would tell me about some of their frustrations, their anger, their problems, what was happening, bad things happening, I'm not, et cetera. And they couldn't put a label on it. And I said, so when you talk to people, what do you say? And they said, oh, you don't talk about it? I mean, my God, talk to somebody else and say, I hate the patients I'm working with? I mean, I really wish they would drop off the end of the earth? No. Later on, somebody working in poverty law told me, well, I don't know what you call it elsewhere, but we call it burnout. And so I thought, okay. So in the interviews, at the end of the interview, I would say, so what we've been talking about here, would you call it dehumanization and self-defense? No. What about detached concern? These are all things I had pulled from the literature. Well, no. What about burnout? That's it. And so it was something that was not a theory or something, but it was a label and a description that people said was important. Okay, boy, did I have trouble getting published with this new line of work. And here are several, but not all of the reasons that I would run into. First off, people would say, oh, come on. Not many people do this or have that kind of feeling about their clients or patients or, do bad. It's 1/10 of 1%, right? Stanley Milgram, those are the only people who would do the bad thing of shocking someone. No, not most people, just a crazy few. So you don't have a real issue or problem to look at here. Second one was burnout is actually something else. And I've heard this phrase, old wine in new bottles ad infinitum. Well, you've got some old wine in new bottles. And you know what? Maybe it's depression, and you should study depression. Or, actually, all this stuff on job satisfaction, this is job dissatisfaction. You're just giving a new label to something that's already out there. So there was something that I should go, study these other things. The hardest thing was that the empirical articles that I wrote up on the interviews, later on my psychometric research on developing a measure, would not be reviewed. They would be returned, unread, unreviewed. And the one, this one, we don't publish pop psychology, is what would actually be said. This was said about my psychometric research. We won't publish it in a journal. It's pop. And that probably is because I'm using the term burnout rather than something else, but it was kind of like, this is the phenomenon I'm talking about. So this was getting really difficult. And basically, I was getting advice to do something else. Either go study the other things, get more grounded in clinical and study depression or whatever, but don't do this. But I wanted to do this. This was so exciting. This was people really engaged in issues, emotional. This was not, sophomores coming in to do your experiment and your debriefing and whatever. This meant a lot. And it was a problem. People didn't know how to talk about it. And somehow it just seemed like there's something important going on here. So I didn't give it up. I couldn't get published in journals for quite a while. This was my very first publication on burnout in a magazine called Human Behavior, which was like Psychology Today, but more broadly social science, okay? And there was a freelance writer, Connie Brooke, who does work for New Yorker and others, and she was doing some freelance work, and she said, you should put your stuff there. I mean, I know it's not going to help your career journal thing, but you'll probably reach the people who actually care about this problem. And she was right. So I sent it in. They gave me art. That was the cover of the magazine. And having all of those flames on the matchbook of the, the healthcare, the police, and whatever was like, wow. It generated more response than just about anything else I've ever published. This was back in 1976. This was before email. This was snail mail coming in bags and sacks into the department. And people would be saying things like, oh my God, I thought I was the only one, and now I know there's other people. Let me tell you about da-da-da. Or how come you didn't mention teachers? Teachers have burnout. Let me tell you da-da-da-da. A lot of them would write. They would do more interviews. They'd write things. I'd ask if I could quote them. They would send things back. People would come knocking on my door and say, remember that letter? I was working in the community mental health center, and I locked myself in the back room to write you. Remember that? Yeah, I'm here. Okay, I'd like to talk to you some more. I'd like to work on this. It was an avalanche that came about from a very different path in this magazine. So that's how I sort of got launched. I could not get my measure, which Harrison Goff had really taught me how to do this kind of research and how I had to get data from other people, like the spouses of the police officers, and how I had to get data from, all that kind of things. Could not get it published in a journal, so it finally got published in a company, Consulting Psychologist Press, that Harrison had helped co-found to publish psychological measures, okay? So that it could at least get out and people could use it. Some reflections on all of this. Emerson. Do not go where the path may lead. Go instead where there is no path and leave a trail. And in some sense, I think that's kind of what I've ended up doing with the work that I've done on burnout. It was very much a different path. And let me just point out a few things. One is that social became too small. It was not enough for the problem that I was studying. And so I really had to kind of get retooled and do more study and more work in health. As Bob Levinson knows, we tried for a long time to have a health psychology, kind of group, throughout the UCs and particularly with UCSF. Industrial organizational, Shelley was particularly helpful here. In clinical, in personalities, I've already measured. So that it meant that I was learning much more, applying more things. It also made it a challenge. Where do you publish when finally people are willing to publish it? And they would say, you're publishing in the personality part of JPSP? What's wrong with you? Blah. Other disciplines. My major at Harvard was social relations. As I mentioned, social science. Loved that major. And it really came in handy in terms of going back to sociology, anthro. But I've had to get really deep into medicine, business, education. And the last thing I want to mention is that the interest in this phenomenon and the people doing the research in this area tend to be not in the good old US of A. They are in many, many, many other countries. So it's been a much more international group of colleagues that I have where work is done. It was first in English-speaking countries, so Canada, UK. Then in the 80s, it really kind of exploded in Europe. Lots of work being done by colleagues in the Netherlands, in Sweden, in Germany, also in Israel. Now we're getting research all around the world, in Asia, Africa, South America, and so forth. So the international thing is like, in a funny way, I've had to go elsewhere to find colleagues who are really interested and excited about this same problem. This has been my home base, and this is how I all brought it all together. But it's an interesting phenomenon. That's why I travel a lot. So this is just some of the things that I've done on burnout. Writing these two books developed a model of 6 areas. What we've found is that the model we've taken really more from IO is the job-person fit, the fit between what the job is asking for and what the person brings to it. And it used to be really thought of the person in terms of personality differences, like certain kinds of personality wants to be a surgeon, or something like that. We're more interested in the fit in terms of emotion, in motivation, and the job. And so we've discovered that there are 6 areas right now where that make a huge difference for predicting burnout. And those have to do with the demands, the workload, control, how much control you have over the job, reward, how much recognition you get when you do something well, or if you don't. A lot of those service jobs, doesn't matter how well you work, you don't get any positive feedback. The community, the social relationships at work, huge. Is there trust, support, or unresolved conflict and bullying? Fairness is the whole way things are decided. Who gets what job, whatever. Is it fair or not? And then finally values, and whether there's a good fit between my personal values and what it is I have to do on this job. So these books actually first laid these all out, and we've developed measures as well on those 6 areas. These were edited volumes. The first one over here was the first international conference just on burnout. It was held in Krakow, Poland. It was a collaboration with a professor also in the Netherlands and myself, and we got everybody who was anybody doing work on burnout together around a huge round table and did some wonderful work, which we then put in this volume. This other one is just the most recent one. Some of the studies that I've done that I'm most proud of are these longitudinal studies. They're very different, but they've all been noted for the research and gotten some nice awards for them. This first one that I did was in the 90s with Sharon Jenkins using the IHD archives, the growth studies, Oakland Growth Study and the Guidance Study. And these are people who were first interviewed when they were children or adolescents back in the 1930s and then were followed in subsequent waves into the 1970s. So you have an incredible amount of data on these people as they're growing up. And what we were looking at was their psychological health in adolescence, and then their later choice of the kind of jobs where we knew burnout is more of an issue, and how they felt about the work on this. So it was one of the most difficult studies I ever did. It went on forever. I thought it would never end. I thought it would never see the light of day, but we finally got through it. One gender note, for job satisfaction, it was only men. Why? Because the measures that were collected then asked men about their job, asked their women about their husband's job. So that kind of like, even though we knew they were working, they were a teacher, they were a nurse, no, they were being asked about their husband's job. So that kind of took out all the women in our data there. But it was, again, I learned a huge amount using that data set. I'm not sure I'd do it again, but it was a great study. And then more recently, early predictors of job burnout. Some of the things that Shelley mentioned about the article that's being said is most influential in management journals and so forth is this one. And it was published in 2008. And basically, what we've been able to show is that the measures we have of burnout and of the 6 areas can begin to show early signs of potential problem. Not a full-blown problem, but a potential sign. And the combination of those can predict whether it's going to get worse or whether it's going to get better a year later. So this has been really exciting stuff for us because we think we now have tools that we can really sort of adapt for use by people to actually do things in the organization that will actually make it more healthy, doing a better job. So this is starting to apply the research tools for organizational improvement. We've put it all in a program that organizations can run themselves. They don't have to have us come and do it. Although it's interesting, sometimes they want an outsider to do this rather than do it inside. So there's still that kind of issue. This is one of the first organizations, and it's a local one. Just to show you some of what we've done here, you can see the 6 areas along the bottom. And basically what we did is when we did the first assessment on these 6 areas, we plotted them against the norm for this occupational group. So if the bars are going up, they're doing better than the norm. Bars going down, they're doing worse. People, a couple of things. One, people, when I usually ask them in advance, where do you think your problems are? What do you think is going to come out when we look at this? And they usually say workload is going to be a huge issue. More often than not, it's not the workload. It is, I can't stand the people in my office. They are just such difficult ones, and my boss in particular doesn't, blah, 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 blah. Work is okay, but it's a toxic social environment. In this particular case, this organization, the managers were particularly upset that fairness was negative. How could it be that our employees don't think we are fair in terms of this? So that's what they targeted as, we're going to make changes. We're going to get people to do things. So in the intervening year, they had all these units working on how to have a better Distinguished Service Award, because everybody thought the current one was really unfair as to who got it. How could they do a more fair process of hearing new ideas, et cetera? So when you look at it a year later, you can see a real increase, much more positive, but there were positive changes all the way through. Because to work on fairness, you have to be able to talk to people, and maybe the relationships get a little bit better, and all of this kind of thing. This particular organization has been doing this ever since on their own, every year since 2000, because it is a checkup that they can do annually to find out where their problems are, and they know how to work with it. So having developed these kind of tools, worked with them to set it up, this is really, really terrific. One other thing I might mention about this particular group is that we looked at the data before we went back that they had sent in, and we had asked if they would give us units as well so we could cluster, and we saw one unit that looked really bad according to our new measures that we now knew could predict. And so we called up and said, so what's happening with Unit E? Dead silence on the other end. How did you know? I said, we didn't know anything. They looked like they're going to be in trouble. They were huge trouble. That unit had just sort of imploded. There was embezzling going on. There was all kinds of other stuff. They had to do a sting operation to go in to find out all the trouble. We didn't know anything about it, but we did know that those early predictors were saying something's wrong in this cluster over here. So that was almost like the best evidence that we could bring to persuade them about it. Shelley mentioned we've started a new international journal, started publication this year, called Burnout Research. There are now more than 1,000, 1,500 articles getting published every year on burnout around the world, scattered among several hundred journals. So no one journal even comes up to 10%, much less 5% of their articles on burnout. So we're really trying to have a way in which we can pull this together and commission articles and research and policy statements that wouldn't get published anywhere else, but they could here. That's our goal, that's our hope. So, getting down to sort of a final reflection on this. And first, the most significant difference. I was deeply, deeply influenced by a speech, a presidential address that I heard back in the late 60s. It was George Miller, who was, famous for his work on memory, and usually presidential addresses they talk about all of their research, right? He went, and instead of doing that, he did this brilliant speech about, in psychology, what do we need to do, given all that's happening in the world and moving forward and so forth. And he talked about, most important thing we have to figure out is how to give psychology away. Not just give it to the journals, but actually give it in a way that can be used by others, can be worked on with others, can make a difference. And I came out of that address really just saying, wow, this is, and I'm in graduate school, this is, all exciting. And I think at some level, this is the thing that for me, looking back on more than 40 years in the work I do on burnout in particular, this is why it's so exciting. This is why it's been so satisfying, is that you're saying, yeah, that was a wonderful goal. I was so inspired and impressed by it. And I think that's kind of what I've been doing. So Emerson, again, to give of oneself, to leave the world a bit better, whether by a healthy child, a garden patch, or a redeemed social condition, to know that even one life has breathed easier because you have lived, this is to have succeeded. Thank you. Thank you.
So you talked about cultural differences. Why did the Europeans take to the burnout research more quickly than Americans? We all supposed to love our jobs and work 80 hours a week and
Right, yeah. It's a great question, and I've often asked other people to come up with. There's all kinds of answers, and it's probably multi-determined in some ways, because it's more in some countries than in others. But there are some countries that have been, even before I started doing any of this work, really interested in how do you create healthy environments for people to live in. Sweden, for example, is kind of on the top of that list in terms of social policy and national policy around this. So they've been thinking about those issues, and this was something that they could just sort of bring in and work on. I think in general, when I've talked to people in Europe in particular about this, they're more often focused on issues of there's a better balance between work and the rest of life. And they always tease us Americans, who go, oh my God, I'm working so hard, I'm so stressed, all this kind of thing. And yeah, but they take many weeks off for vacation. They have a lot of policies in different countries that actually recognize the balance between work and family, for example, or other kind of things. So I think that's part of that. I have to say that it was in the 80s, there was sort of a transition from the work I did in the 70s, which in a sense was more social and clinical, focus on relationships. I mean, that's really where my interest has been. And that when I started getting into more IO concepts around job stress and measures, and stuff like that, that seemed to get a lot of people saying, oh, wait, we could do that. When you have a measure now, they can do the, research on it. So I think that's a part of it. What I've also learned, however, is that in different countries, the kinds of work that is done on different industries, there's no clear, match with what we do here. So a lot of, for example, the health research, medical research, biomedical research is done in petroleum companies in South America, which is kind of, that's where they do that with their workers, So it's a different kind of thing. So I think there are a number, of factors. The other thing is that I cannot tell you how many of some of these countries, people who work there have a way to talk to the government. It's a smaller country. There's a single government. We have 50. And so they will say, so, we just collected this data on all of the dentists, in Finland to see because they have a stressful, or everybody in the Netherlands or, whatever, something like that. So what is the comparable data you have in the United States? And I'm going, are you kidding me? I can't even begin, how hard it is to get into organizations to do this kind of work because they're all very interested, they want to do something, but they don't want to be the one that actually participates in any work where data is collected. We're such a litigious society that they're not even willing to try sort of experiments. So it's a different challenge to do the work here than it is in other places. So those are just a few, I think, of the reasons. And it's not to say that they're always better. Back in the 90s, my colleague in the Netherlands, Wilmar Schauffele, and I were called to Sweden, of all places, saying, oh my God, have we got a crisis with burnout? You've got to help us, kind of thing. And I'm thinking, what? And what they were finding was that they were seeing a sharp increase in people in certain occupations, not blue collar, white collar, more likely healthcare, IT, who were going out on long-term sick leave. Because the policy in Sweden is if you're stressed or having problems or whatever, you get diagnosed, you get put out for, year and a half, 2 years, and your job is saved so you can come back and you get treatment and all that kind of thing. But they were seeing this real escalation in certain occupations. And the Swedes keep data on everything, so we could go back and find out what was the diagnosis. And in more than 2/3 of the cases, the diagnosis was severe clinical depression, work-related only. And so they're thinking, that's burnout. And I'm saying, that is post-burnout. You had a problem further upstream, and now you've got severe clinical depression, So, I mean, again, there are things that can happen for all kinds of reasons. But it's been true, it's been that, yeah. Wow.
So you started the talk by saying serendipity was really important, but I think thinking about the entire talk, it's really a talk about adversity and how you dealt with it. And
yeah.
it started with sexism, and then nepotism, and then topicism, and then you had to go abroad to be able to establish your bona fides. And
right.
And it made me think that it's a career that really was defined by a lot of fires that you had to sort of survive. And so as you think about, the way we train people and do careers now, what's the ideal amount of adversity that you recommend?
Put them through,
that we
right?
create for producing people who live lives that are productive and happy and don't burn out?
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's a great question to think about. I would say it's not necessarily always adversity. I think it's being put in a situation you've never been in before, and you now have to figure out some solutions, as to how you're going to deal with that. And I think there are a lot of ways in which we can give people more in their training responsibility and independence of, okay, so what are you going to do with this study? Okay, you can try different things and see what you come up with. Or what would you know what I'm saying? I mean, try and figure out some things that give people more opportunities to have to stretch, to have to face the data just didn't show up. What the hell is going on? And how to deal with that, and not have that be the first time you encounter that is when you're doing your dissertation. That you should have had more experiences with those kinds of things. I mean, it sort of reminds me of some other data, which unfortunately we never got around to publishing. But I had a number of undergraduates who, on the individuation thing, who talked about friends of theirs who just seemed to be higher in social impact in any kind of group situation than anybody else. And everybody could name a few. Oh, yeah, it's that person, it's that person. So we did a study where they went out and interviewed people who were nominated as being these people that everybody would sort of say, the go-to person, the social impact person, can count on them kind of thing. And what came out of the interviews, the most striking theme, was that virtually everyone had gone through some real difficult hardship early on in life. And for a lot of them, it was, given our student population, this is when we were getting a lot more Vietnamese students who had just come over from Vietnam, immigrated in, the boats and everything when they were 2 years old or something. And a lot of them had to take care of their younger brothers and sisters, had to work to help support the family at a very young age, or there was a major crisis or death in the family, and suddenly the kids, and this is not those immigrants particularly, but others, suddenly having to take on that kind of thing. So later in life, it's kind of like, what are we going to do? Oh, I got some ideas. We could run this. Why don't we get these people? That sort of thing. I wouldn't recommend that you put everybody through that kind of thing, but it's like, what are other experiences that might give people that kind of, lateral growth in a lot of other areas, and, more of a chance to have to think on your feet and come up with a different way of doing it. And I think that's what I ended up, learning from a number of these things. What do you do when you're then faced with this, even if it's an interesting challenge and it's not necessarily adversity? How would you do that? So I would try and think of, I do think that the experience we had of actually having to do the research we designed to be better was a wonderful, wonderful training experience. And I don't know that we do that kind of thing enough. Really force you into a different kind of position, maybe with a hypothesis you don't like or think is the best, whatever. How would you go about really testing whether there's any merit there? See what you can do. So, yeah. Yep. Oh, you've got it. Yes. Designated mic. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you for such a gutsy talk. It was really inspirational.
Oh, thank you.
You've touched on this just a tiny bit in a couple of your responses now, but as we work with families, especially men and women who are parents of young children, right. And as more mothers are at work, even when their babies and children are very young, and as more fathers are taking a larger role in the family and in caring for the children, it made me wonder whether anything you're finding in the burnout concept, even though you may be just talking to people about their work, do you think there's any contribution of the struggle to find this balance of work and family that contributes to some people getting burned out because they simply don't know how to do it all? They can't pull it off.
Right. No, that's an excellent question. And yeah, there is data on that do show that people who have more difficulty in handling the boundaries, if I can put it that way, between work and the rest of life, have more trouble with burnout, because in a sense, you never get away from it. You take your work home, you're on call. There's just a whole bunch of things. Or you're not really there with your kids because you got to be doing something else. And it really is important to be, we've found, is that there are those boundaries where you have to say, no matter what, hell or high water, this weekend, not doing any work, or something like that. And often it's policies in organizations where people work. I mean, it's not that they decide, I want to be on call for a patient. That's part of the job description. What we're seeing now is more and more, as we get more online and more possible to be in touch with people around the world, you could be on and have to be on talking to the affiliate company in Shanghai when you would rather be asleep or doing some other kind of thing like that. So we're seeing in different ways that kind of mushing and blurring that is a problem. So the people who do the best that we found as we've been following them are ones who, it's not only the boundaries, but also focusing on how to support the stuff that really means a lot to me in my family, and not, it's easy for the job to take over 50, 60, 70, 80, 90%. So I would get things from interviews like, the one that was really hit me the most was once I was interviewing adolescents, and these were all children of people who were ministers, okay? And I remember one young kid saying, my father, is just the greatest guy, he's out there in the community, he's set up this, he's doing this, that, like that. He's never there for me. And that was the thing, the family sacrificed for this other thing. And so he's never there, I can't talk to him, when he comes home, he's too busy, et cetera. So I think there's a lot more to think about in terms of recommendations for that.
Okay, last question. It was a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I want to ask you about the issue of burnout being pop psychology and why you think that is. And do you think it is viewed that way today, and why?
No, it's changed.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm curious about your answer, but it strikes me as you talked about the work, you began in a very different way. You went into the field,
Yeah.
the community, you spoke to the people,
Right.
and you spoke to them within their social context,
Right.
the real natural world, and the work
Right, I
came
didn't bring
from
him here
there.
to Berkeley. No, that's true. That's true. I think there were a couple of things. Where I was getting hit a lot early on was that, in a sense, I was working bottom up from a social problem rather than top down from a theoretical model about stress or however you wanted to think about the depression or something like that. And that automatically was not viewed as a good thing, that I should be more theoretical, I should be doing more basic work. People say, how did you start your burnout work? What theory did you have? I didn't have a theory. I was going with the problem, trying to say, how can I understand it? Are there, and it turned out lots of different theories and stuff could be brought to bear, no one of which did the whole thing. But it was clear that it was such an important issue for so many people. Not only important, but ones that the stigma, that I don't dare let anybody know, sort of saying, something is really going on here, and that I need to understand that. So I think being driven by a sort of social problem or bottom up, using, if you will, the language of the people, they called it burnout, so I'm going to call it burnout, I'm not going to call it something else, I think had a problem as well. One of our first articles on a sample that we used for our psychometric, but it was with police officers and their spouses. And Susan Jackson and I deliberately chose not to use burnout in the title. And nobody sent it back unread. They reviewed it and then it went on. So I think there was some of that. Now, it's almost as if burnout is everywhere. Everybody talks about it. I worry that it's being used to stretch to mean everything, and therefore means nothing because you can't differentiate it in some way. But it's being recognized in a lot of businesses and organizations that this captures a problem that we have.
Psychology.
Huh?
Psychology.
Yeah.
Psychology recognized.
Oh, psychology, yeah. Yeah, psychology is recognizing it. But it's going beyond psychology. I really can't, sort of keep it there. So it is being taken seriously. I've just asked somebody in Germany to write an article for our new journal because there's been this huge debate going on in Germany about the appropriate policy to take with burnout, and how to treat it and what sort of things should be. I mean, this is a national kind of debate. Most of the rest of us don't know what's going on there. So in that sense, it's being recognized now as wherever it started and ever how pop it was, there's a real phenomenon. And this also, as soon as we were able to get data that showed that it wasn't just that people felt bad, they were doing lousy work, they weren't showing up, they were making mistakes, it was costing the organization. A lot of the research we've done and is now doing are with nurses in hospitals. And they were the ones who said civility, big issue in the community part of the 6 areas. How you talk to each other, how you treat each other. Are you rude? Are you snarky? Are you sarcastic? Do you put people down? Not even as far as bullying, that kind of thing. And the research that we've done is found an intervention that it can actually turn that situation around. So we get data that shows that now they're treating each other better and they're working better and whatever. And we try always, we don't always get it, a behavioral measure, not just self-report. But sometimes that's hard to come by. They don't want to share work injuries or whatever. But absenteeism is one of the biggest problems facing nursing. People don't show up, and you need to cover. And what do you do? And the nurse is saying, if that's a toxic social environment, I've had it up to here, I can't face it today, I'm not going in. So the absenteeism rates, really changed and really dropped as a result of that, and they started coming back to work. And so for us, it's kind of like saying, okay, we've been able to identify something, been able to give tools to use to study it, and no matter where it got born and how it started, it's actually helping people now to get to a healthier workplace, healthier environment to live in. And that's ultimately what I think is so important.
It's so fascinating, but I think we have to stop because we have a whole
A lot of food and drink. Yes. Okay. Thank you.